Before there were Amber Alerts, there were the Milk Carton Kids. The Milk Carton Initiative was adopted by the Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1985 as a way to try to bring missing children home. Despite the program's limited success during its own time, it laid the groundwork for the modern protocols used to find missing children today. Since the 90s, the number of missing children has dropped by 40%. Without the Milk Carton Kids, specifically the 4 boys we will discuss today, it's very unlikely that joint efforts amongst law enforcement agencies across the country would have been as fruitful as they have been. Hey besties, and welcome to the Crafty Crimes podcast featuring Crafty Cat here because he just wants attention today. Today we will be exploring the precursor to the Amber Alert, the Milk Carton Initiative. Primarily we're going to talk about Johnny Gosch, the most famous Milk Carton Kid, and the boy whose story is most well documented. But we're also going to touch on the other 3 missing boys whose disappearances helped launch the initiative. And while we do that, I am going to be coloring this clown photo here, partially because TikTok requested I do another coloring episode, and partially because I accidentally left my hooks at work, so I can't crochet this week. So, this is your warning up top that child sex trafficking and child sexual assault and child abductions will be mentioned today. So if that's not your thing, you'll want to skip this episode. So with all of that in mind, get comfy, grab your crafting supplies or your Joe pens, like in my case, and learn the story of the Milk Carton Kids with me. While Etan Patz is the first official Milk Carton Kid, we're actually going to start today's tale with the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. Johnny's story is more well known than Etan's and has captivated audiences far more, probably due to its lack of resolution. Etan's face would be printed on milk cartons starting in 1985, 6 years after his disappearance. And while his is the first face to be circulated for the Milk Carton Initiative by the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Johnny's photo would appear in print in Iowa the year prior, thanks to a local dairy farmer. Also, because we will be talking about 4 missing kids today, I'm not going to spend as much time establishing backgrounds today. The Gosches lived quiet, untroubled lives with their 3 children before their 12-year-old son, Johnny Gosch, vanished into thin air on September 5th, 1982. The family lived in a quiet, well-kept cul-de-sac in West Des Moines, a larger suburb of the Des Moines metropolitan area. Living in a small neighborhood allowed the Gosches to become close to their neighbors, which ends up being the reason 12-year-old Johnny was discovered missing to begin with. At the time of his disappearance, Johnny worked as a paperboy for the local newspaper, which was a common way for kids around this age to earn extra cash in the 80s. It was actually because of the disappearances of the Des Moines 3 that paper companies stopped hiring miners to run their paper routes, at least in Iowa. That Sunday morning in early September started the same way as every other Sunday morning. Young Johnny got himself ready for his paper route and left his family home with his dachshund Gretchen. Later that afternoon, Gretchen would return home without her human in tow. Even so, no one knew Johnny had gone missing for several hours. It wasn't until a neighbor called to complain about not receiving the paper that the Gosches began to worry about their 12-year-old son. John Gosch, the father of the missing boy, went walking to find his son. He found Johnny's little red wagon 2 blocks from home, abandoned in front of a church, with all the newspapers unbundled and undelivered inside. And for whatever reason, John decided to finish his son's paper route. When I initially read that John Sr. finished Johnny's paper route, I was kind of perplexed. It didn't make sense to me at the time, and I had worked with the assumption that this was just the work ethic at the time. However, after giving it some thought, I think it makes sense that John at least walked his son's route. If we work with the assumption that Johnny went missing while delivering papers, then maybe it stands to reason he went missing or got sidetracked somewhere along his path and John wanted to be extra thorough. Though I guess that doesn't really explain why he went through the trouble of actually bundling and delivering the papers. I feel like I'm getting bogged down by the wrong detail, though. When the Gosches didn't find Johnny along his paper route, the neighbors banded together to search for him. It's a shame we don't value community like this anymore, too. I wonder how many less stories like this we'd hear if we all looked out for each other. I'm not sure how the neighborhoods y'all live in are, but my neighbors seem way more concerned with tearing each other down and complaining than they do about the community and looking out for each other. Honestly, I could probably make a whole episode about the insane things my neighbors say, but that's beside the point. Johnny was reported missing to police the same day he went missing. One of the neighbors watched the other Gosch children while Noreen and John looked for their boy. Initially, the police did treat Johnny's case as an abduction, but after about 3 days with no real leads or evidence, the case was changed to a suspected runaway. The only lead investigators really had to work with was a blue Ford Fairmount seen talking to Johnny about 6 that morning. But no one who reported seeing the car was able to say if he climbed into the car willingly or if he was forced in. In fact, no one was able to say if Johnny got in the car at all. I know we all get really frustrated by police not taking child abduction seriously. However, when you look at it from their perspective, it makes sense. It's not enough to say that a child is good. You have to be able to prove what you know and how you know it, and unfortunately, knowing or believing someone is a good kid doesn't automatically make them one. Developmentally, kids are insanely impulsive around this age, and you simply can't dismiss impulsiveness as a motive when it comes to children, especially when it comes to running away. You have to be able to back what you know and say with hard evidence, and there just wasn't a way to do that with this case. I think all of you will be pleased to know, though, that Johnny's case is not considered cold. The West Des Moines police handling this investigation told Iowa news station KCCI as recently as the fall of 2022 that they assign a detective to review the evidence every few months. In 1988, the FBI began testing age-advancing technology to visualize what missing children might look like years after they go missing. And Johnny's face was the first to use this new software, projecting what he might look like at 18 years old. This has made it possible for people to continue calling in with tips about Johnny's whereabouts. While the tips don't come often, they do still come, and people claim to see Johnny all over the United States. Most recently, Johnny has been aged up to 54, which is only a few years off from what his actual age would be today. Aging software has also been used on the other 2 boys from Des Moines. Johnny's mother, Noreen, has been relentless in the search for her son, as I'd imagine most parents with missing children are. After almost 43 years, Noreen still firmly believes her Johnny is alive. Over the years, she's pointed a finger at several men, including Paul Bonacci in 1991. Supposedly, Bonacci made a claim that he helped kidnap Johnny Gosch and sold him into a pedophile trafficking ring. At the time, Bonacci was serving time for sexually assaulting a young teenage boy, so his claim seemed probable. But his confession didn't really go anywhere and led to nothing. Noreen, however, was still convinced that Bonacci was involved. In 1999, Noreen publicly made a very wild claim. She announced that her son was alive and had visited her 2 years prior in March 1997. She explained that a man knocked on her door at 2:30 in the morning and unbuttoned his shirt to reveal a birthmark on his chest, signifying that he was Johnny Gosch. Noreen said that there was another man with him who didn't speak at all during the visit. Allegedly, Johnny spent an hour at the house explaining to his mother how he had been kidnapped, trafficked, and forced to perform sexually for politicians and other important people to put them in a compromising position. He then said he had to go and that he wasn't safe and disappeared into the night. Noreen said in her interview with the press that she didn't come forward with this information for 2 years for fear of her son's safety. John Gosch had divorced Noreen a few years prior and said that he seriously doubted this interaction happened. I happen to agree with John on this one. The details of the story are just so vague and, this is a very generic tale, and unfortunately I think that detracts from its credibility. Noreen seems to have fallen apart over the years. In her pursuit for justice for her son, Noreen has lost her grip on reality. Personally, I believe her previous story about Johnny's visit was a very vivid dream. Her public image is further hampered by her constant accusations of misconduct against the police department and outright accusations against strangers, claiming that they were involved in the kidnapping of her son. She's been very vocal of her distaste for the lack of information given to her by police about their investigation. She believed that she should know about every lead, new piece of evidence, and every tip that came in, and law enforcement disagreed. Noreen is still hopeful that her son will come to visit her again one day. John Sr. has accepted that he will never see Johnny again, but admits he still passively looks for his son every time he leaves the house. If you thought Johnny's disappearance was scarce on information, then you'll be shocked to know that even less is known about the disappearances of the other two Des Moines boys, Eugene Martin and Marc Allen, and just as little is known about Etan Patz's disappearance. 12-year-old Eugene went missing from South Des Moines during his paper route on August 12, 1984. He arrived to collect and bundle his papers around 5 a.m. People who passed by as Eugene prepped his papers said he seemed to be engaged in friendly conversation with a clean-shaven man in his 30s or 40s. The man was said to have brown hair and an average build at roughly 5 feet 9 inches, which is about as generic as you can get. 5:15 a.m. is the last time anyone saw Eugene. Just like in Johnny's case, Eugene was discovered missing when a woman on his paper route called to complain about not getting the morning paper. The call came about 45 minutes after Eugene was last seen. Eugene's manager drove the route until he found the abandoned wagon with 10 newspapers left inside. The manager finished Eugene's route, then stopped by the Martin house to ask the family if Eugene was okay. Based on this reaction alone, I'm going out on a limb here to say that Eugene was probably considered pretty responsible. Don Martin, the father, realized his son hadn't returned home yet, so he began to search the neighborhood. Dawn reported Eugene missing by 8:45 that morning. It's so upsetting to know that the police began their missing persons investigation with 3.5 hours of Eugene's disappearance, and it still went unsolved. Thanks to the nationwide commotion Johnny's case caused, the Johnny Gosch bill was passed in Iowa in 1984. This bill required law enforcement to immediately follow up on and investigate all reports of missing children. While it's awful this wasn't standard protocol until the mid-'80s, I'm glad the disappearances of these boys brought some good back into the world. Not only had the Johnny Gosch bill pushed Des Moines Police Department to act quickly in Eugene's case, but it also allowed them to involve the FBI within the first 24 hours. Locals were quick to put together the similarities between Johnny's disappearance and Eugene's. However, because the kidnappings happened in different areas of Des Moines, they were under different jurisdictions. The two cases have never been formally connected, but the general consensus amongst citizens is that they are. Believe it or not, I'm actually with the public on this one. The similarities become even more apparent when Marc Allen disappears in 1986. I bet if the police had released the composite sketch of the suspected driver of the Ford Fairmount that was seen talking to Johnny, we would have gotten closer to connecting the two cases, or at least would have more reason to suspect that they're unrelated. Either way, this would have been a great time for that composite sketch, but they never released it for whatever reason. 2 kidnappings in 2 years absolutely rocked Des Moines. Families started watching their children more closely, and paper companies stopped hiring young teen boys as delivery boys. A local dairy farmer wanted to help bring both missing boys home. Reaching out to the families first, he got permission to use the faces in print. The faces of Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin were printed on the side of paper milk cartons for the first time in 1984, sparking a nationwide movement. Soon enough, the faces of missing children were printed on paper milk cartons for every American to see. The Center for Missing and Exploited Children decided to adopt the practice on a larger scale in 1985, launching the Missing Children's Milk Carton Program, or, the Milk Carton Initiative. The first child they printed was 6-year-old Etan Patz, who we'll talk about next. The program ran from 1985 to about 1995. Despite its limited success, it did lay the groundwork for Amber Alerts, which took the program's place in 1996. Honestly, it makes sense with the increasing popularity of televisions and eventually cell phones. Milk, while still a household staple, just couldn't compete with tech advances. Eugene Martin is still missing. Just like with Johnny Gosch, there were no eyewitnesses or forensic evidence to push the investigation forward. The case isn't considered open, but it's not entirely cold either. The police department revisits the case when a credible lead comes in, but otherwise the boxes remain on their shelves. And it has been years since a tip has been called in about Eugene. Now we're going to back things up to discuss Etan Patz, the only boy in this story not from Des Moines. Across the country, 3 years before Johnny disappeared, 6-year-old Etan went missing in 1979 during the 2-block walk from his house to the bus stop. While he is not the first child whose missing poster was printed on a milk carton, he was the first case to be adopted by a recognized organization and printed nationwide, which is why I wanted to include Etan's story with this narrative. Etan was born in Manhattan, New York on October 9th, 1972, to Stanley and Julie Patz. He was born into a large and loving family. On May 25th, 1979, 6-year-old Etan begged his mother to let him walk to the bus stop alone, and for the first time ever, Julie agreed. She handed her son his things for the day and gave him $1 for a soda. She walked her son to the end of the driveway and watched her son walk until he left her sight. But something tragic happened to Etan in the 2 blocks from his house to the Soho bus stop, and this would be the last time Julie ever saw him. I'm sure that morning replays in her mind all the time, and the guilt eats at her. Julie spent that day assuming her son got on the bus and made it safely to school. But a feeling of unease crept in when Etan didn't arrive home around his usual time. But Julie decided to wait, thinking maybe her young son had just gotten sidetracked on his journey home. Another choice, I'm sure, haunts her. Afternoon bled into evening, and Etan still hadn't made it home. Julie began to panic. She called the school and learned that Etan had never arrived for class that day. The worst day of Julie's life had officially begun. If you thought the evidence for Johnny's and Eugene's cases was scarce, then Etan's case is going to make you want to hit your head against a wall. Despite Etan going missing from a busy New York street next to the bus stop, no one had anything to report, at least nothing helpful. There was no vehicle description to work with or eyewitnesses to give a composite sketch. Etan's body has never been found, and there has not been any forensic evidence to suggest that he's dead. The police conducted dozens of interviews, including one with the man who would later be convicted of killing Etan. But the investigation still went stale. Nonetheless, Etan's disappearance rocked the nation far more than Johnny's or Eugene's disappearances did. On the 4-year anniversary of his disappearance, Ronald Reagan named May 25th National Missing Children's Day. A lovely, heartfelt sentiment, but nowhere near enough to heal hearts. Etan was officially pronounced dead on November 15th, 2001. It was later revealed that police believed Etan was killed the same day he went missing, but with no body and no forensics, it's impossible to say definitively. Unfortunately, the Patzes would live with this unresolved pain until 2005, when a break in the case pointed investigators to Jose Ramos, a Pennsylvania man who was serving time for child molestation. Jose Ramos, considered the prime suspect in Etan's kidnapping, was arrested sometime around 1986 for molesting 2 young boys, making him a very good and very strong suspect. He was one of the individuals initially questioned about Etan's disappearance, but denied knowing anything. It wasn't until Jose Ramos was already behind bars that a new story began to take shape. For whatever reason, Ramos revealed he knew the Patz family before their son went missing. From his prison cell, Ramos stated that he had previously dated the woman who would help walk Etan home from the bus stop. Obviously, Julie and Stanley's minds began to swim with the worst possible scenarios, bolstered by Jose's confession that he was 90% sure he raped Etan in the park that afternoon. He admitted to seeing Etan, or a boy who looked strikingly similar. Hold on, let's back it up. Obviously, Stanley and Julie's minds began to swim with the worst possible scenarios, bolstered by Jose's confession that he was 90% sure he raped Etan. He admitted to seeing Etan, or a boy who looked strikingly similar, in the park that afternoon, which, if that's true, casts a lot of doubt on Pedro Hernandez's confession, but we'll talk about Hernandez in just a minute. But that's where the confession stopped. The Patzes begged Ramos to tell them what happened to their little boy, but Ramos kept silent. Because the courts couldn't criminally convict Jose Ramos without a full confession or evidence, the Patzes decided to hold him responsible for their son's disappearance in a civil court. In 2005, Ramos was deemed guilty by default, and the Patzes were awarded a symbolic $2.7 million. Stanley continued to write to Jose every year with just one sentence, asking what happened to Etan. I cannot stress enough that Jose Ramos was not formally convicted of Etan's kidnapping and murder, and that his default status came from Stanley and Julie suing Ramos in a civil court for the death of their boy. After the 2005 court case, Stanley and Julie assumed that this was as good as justice was going to get for them. For years, they hoped Etan's case would be reopened, and it finally happened in May 2010. The Patzes were now just a little hopeful that they'd have answers this time. But the case stayed stagnant until a new tip supposedly blew the case wide open. And, with the details I'm about to reveal, it's honestly kind of shocking that it took this long to get the ball rolling. In the 1980s, a woman named Norma Hernandez walked into the police station to report her brother, Pedro, as the suspected killer and kidnapper of Etan Patz. Norma said she felt like the police didn't take her seriously. She claims they asked her if her and Pedro had recently gotten into a fight, or if she was upset with him for any reason. So it seems like maybe if the police hadn't brushed off Norma's concerns initially, the case would have been resolved much sooner. Apparently, everyone who knew Pedro knew he had done something very bad to a child. According to an ex-wife, Pedro had told her before they got married that he had done something bad to a kid, and his ex-wife assumed it was an older teenager and not as big of a deal as Pedro made it out to be. Which is an absolutely bonkers take, made even crazier by the two divorcing some years later due to Pedro's physical abuse. She very obviously knew he was capable of violence, but, I mean, if she feared for her own safety, then yeah, I guess I could see her not saying something sooner, but still. His pastor, who claimed Pedro was devout and sat in the front row every week, said that Pedro came for an altar call quite a few times, sobbing and asking for forgiveness for hurting a child. Once again, pretty insane that no one decided to, press that matter further or ask what he meant by that or, go to the police with those concerns, but whatever, I guess. Why no one believed he had actually done something terrible to a child is beyond me. It's not like Pedro was a good person to begin with. He already had a rap sheet for domestic violence when he began to have these meltdowns over what he had done. So, I mean, it makes no sense. Finally, the police decided to take the accusations against Hernandez seriously when his brother-in-law contacted police because he suspected Hernandez of killing Etan in 2012. This time, finally, the police did their due diligence and followed up on this tip. Their investigation revealed that Pedro Hernandez had been working as a clerk at a bodega next to the bus stop. Knowing where Etan went missing from, they got permission to tear out some concrete in a basement of a nearby building where the concrete had been freshly poured the week Etan went missing. They thought that maybe Hernandez had hid his body in the concrete. But they didn't find any trace of him in the basement. However, they did get Pedro's confession. After a 7-hour interrogation, Hernandez cracked. He told investigators he lured Etan into the basement of that nearby building with the promise of a soda. Etan, who had $1 in his pocket for that very treat, followed Hernandez into the basement. Pedro said he didn't know what came over him. He just saw the boy and was filled with darkness. Pedro confessed to strangling Etan until he passed out, wrapped him in a plastic bag, then placed him in a box and walked the unconscious boy to a dumpster a block away. He said he believed Etan was still alive when he placed the young boy in that box. Pedro was 17 and Etan was 6. With nothing but Hernandez's confession, the case officially went to trial in 2015. Hernandez's first trial ended with a deadlocked jury. The vote came in 11-1, with the final juror refusing to hand down a verdict. This set the second trial into motion. It took 9 days for the jury to return a guilty verdict. Pedro Hernandez was convicted of first-degree kidnapping and second-degree murder in 2017. After Hernandez's conviction, Stanley Patz had some nasty words to share for him, but he was surprisingly more composed than I would have been. In the courtroom, Patz told Hernandez, "After all these years, we finally know what dark secret you kept locked in your heart. You took our precious child and threw him in the garbage. I will never forgive you. The God you pray to will never forgive you. You are the monster in your nightmares, and you will join your father in hell." I have no idea what he means by the "you will join your father in hell" bit. I don't know if that's like differing religious views or if Pedro's dad was also a shitbag and had died. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but that is what he said. And honestly, pop off. You are the monster in your nightmares. Like that. That's about as real as it gets. The Patzes publicly addressed Jose Ramos after Pedro was convicted of Etan's murder. Stanley claims that if they had had the information in 2005 that they had now, they never would have pursued Ramos as a suspect. They are currently working to get Ramos's guilty by default charge dropped, saying they don't believe he should live with that title if it doesn't belong to him. While this conviction overjoyed the Patz family, some still hold their doubts about Hernandez's guilt. Lisa Cohen, an author who is regarded as the expert on Etan's case, says she had never heard of Pedro before his conviction, but didn't really have much else to say about it. Hernandez's attorney also maintains his client's innocence, citing Pedro's poor mental health, low IQ, and a long police interrogation as reasons to why Hernandez believed he committed the crime when he hadn't. Additionally, if we take Ramos's quasi-confession into account, then Etan would have still been alive well after Pedro Hernandez abandoned him in a dumpster, and it means that he got out of the dumpster. Whether or not we take Lisa's and Jose's words into account, there's no way to prove anyone wrong. I hope this conviction gave Stanley and Julie peace, and the sad thing is they never moved from their Manhattan home where their son disappeared. Okay, I know it's annoying. I personally hate it when timelines and stories aren't linear. However, I was struggling to find a way to do that and not make the narrative insanely confusing. So, bear with me one more time as we move backwards in time to talk about the last person in today's episode, Marc Allen. I saved Marc for last for a few reasons. First, he was the last to go missing out of the Des Moines 3. Secondly, Marc has the least amount of information and attention out of all these cases, which is tragic. All of these cases should have been treated with the same care and respect as the others. Mark's story mostly exists in reference to Johnny's, and that makes me kind of sad and enraged, honestly. Every child deserves to have their story told, and none of them should be pushed aside or buried. Every missing child is someone's baby. On March 29th, 1986, 13-year-old Marc Allen left his Des Moines home to walk a few blocks to a friend's house. On his way out the door, Mark called to his mother, asking her to save him some pizza because he'll be hungry when he gets home. His mother watched as her son walked down the sidewalk and disappeared behind some nearby bushes. Nancy, Mark's mother, expected her son home before the night ended. After all, the next day was Easter, and he said he'd be back. But Mark never reached his destination, and being 1986, I'm sure Mark's unnamed friend didn't think too much about Mark not coming over that afternoon. It wasn't until the next morning that Nancy discovered Mark wasn't home, but panic hadn't set in yet. Assuming Mark stopped to stay with his grandmother that night, Nancy called her mother. Mark wasn't there. Nancy then began to call Mark's friends, and when none of them had seen her son, the terror finally set in, and she reported Mark missing. And here is the infuriating part. Despite the Johnny Gosch bill being passed 2 years prior, the police told Nancy that she had to wait 48 hours before they could begin investigating his disappearance. His brother would say decades later in an interview that he felt like his brother's disappearance never got the attention or care it deserved. And I agree. Mark's early life was tumultuous. He lived with his grandmother in Connecticut from 7 months old to about 4.5 years old. Then from 4.5 to 10, he lived with his mother, Nancy, in Des Moines. He then briefly lived with his father in Minnesota from 1983 to sometime in 1985. From 1985 until his disappearance, Mark was living with Nancy in Des Moines again. That's a lot, and I'm sorry, but basically he bounced around between relatives quite a bit. The first person they contacted at the end of the 2-day wait period was Mark's father, who lived in Minnesota. Mr. Allen denied having seen his son. Next, they called the grandmother in Connecticut, and she also denied seeing Mark. Nancy Allen was now officially facing the same nightmare as Julie Patz, Noreen Gosch, and Margaret Martin Dove, and honestly countless other mothers. The frustration of the Allen family was amplified by the police treating their son's case as a runaway teen. Mark, like the other 3 boys in this narrative, was never found. And I'm sorry, but having covered so many missing children's cases so far, I don't understand how missing kids were never more of a big deal. Maybe in the days when kids could be sent in the mail via train, it was no biggie, but in the 80s? We didn't take missing children seriously in the 80s? That's just disgraceful. Unfortunately, I can't tell you when Mark's face joined Johnny's or Eugene's or Etan's on a milk carton. There was so frustratingly little information about Marc Allen that it made me want to scream. He is only ever mentioned in reference to Johnny. Every single missing child deserves the same amount of attention. Every single missing child is someone's entire heart, their entire world. So how has this child been missing for nearly 40 years and no one talks about him unless the topic's about Johnny? I know that statement makes me a massive hypocrite, but come on. 40 years and you genuinely can't say anything about Mark other than that he went missing in 1986? Marc Allen's story is just one of thousands of forgotten lives, and that genuinely angers me to my core. Folks who followed the cases, primarily the Des Moines Three, were quick to point out the similarities between the abductions of John, Eugene, and Marc. All three boys were about the same age. They disappeared while walking alone in Des Moines, and the three kidnappings all happened roughly 2 years apart. This has many netizens believing that the boys were kidnapped by a pedophile ring and trafficked, an idea further perpetuated by Johnny Gosch in her many interviews. Police, on the other hand, have not officially linked the cases. Initially, when you see how law enforcement handles these cases, it seems like they're missing something pretty obvious. However, let's take a step back to look at the bigger picture and look at why these cases aren't considered connected. To start, I want to clarify and say that personally, I do believe that they're connected. Based on the information available to the public, which is the key distinction here, I believe the similarities I listed above are too striking to be coincidence. However, I feel like I'd be doing you, my audience, and more importantly, the victims, a disservice by not looking at all of these cases from various angles. So first, let's take a look at the differences between Johnny Gosch's disappearance and Eugene Martin's. 12-year-old Johnny and 13-year-old Eugene were both paper boys who disappeared early in the morning during their paper routes. But honestly, those are where the similarities stop. Johnny had blue eyes and Eugene had brown. Johnny went missing from a quiet suburb in West Des Moines, which is part of the greater Des Moines metro. Eugene went missing from the actual city of Des Moines, putting the two disappearances in different jurisdictions. Johnny disappeared before he even had the chance to begin his paper route, and Eugene disappeared sometime towards the end of his. Additionally, the MO is unknown, but the events immediately preceding the kidnappings that are known are different. A car was seen stopped talking to Johnny, but there was no report of the average man talking to Eugene having a blue car. When you pull Marc's disappearance into the mix, the differences become even more stark. Unlike Johnny and Eugene, Marc wasn't a paper boy, and instead of going missing during the early morning hours on a Sunday, Marc disappeared on a Sunday afternoon. Johnny and Eugene had stable home lives, while Marc's living situation seemed precarious, which put him at an increased risk to be the victim of a violent crime, by the way. Now, to be fair, there were no witnesses to Marc's kidnapping, so we can't say if his abduction involved a blue Ford Fairmont, or a brown-haired man at the scene. So now that the similarities and differences have been laid out, I hope you can see and understand why these cases haven't been formally linked. However, despite there being no tangible connection, primarily due to the lack of MO, investigators do believe that a trafficking ring could be involved. I know as citizens we often get frustrated with law enforcement for not seeing what we think is obvious, but please remember that they have to be able to definitively prove, without guessing, what we consider to be obvious. Do I think any of these boys are still alive? No, not at all. More often than not, child abductions end in murder, and unfortunately, that tends to happen pretty quickly. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline website, the 2024 data shows that the majority of trafficking victims in the state of Iowa are adult women, and they are primarily used for sex. And if the boys had been sex trafficked, they likely would have been killed because, you don't just stay trafficked indefinitely, especially because, child predators are sadists. Given this information, I find it statistically more likely that they were abducted and murdered pretty quickly. But, like I said earlier, I'm also not willing to rule trafficking out altogether, especially because there weren't really any statistics for child trafficking in the 1980s. 1980s. Regardless, all 4 of these boys, including Etan, faced a hard end. And that, my friends, ends the tale of the Milk Carton Kids. The faces of these 4 young boys were just the first of hundreds to be seen across the United States during the decade that the Missing Children's Milk Carton program ran. Out of the 4 boys we discussed today, Etan Patz has been the only one to receive justice. The Gosch, Martin, and Allen families are unlikely to ever know what happened to their beloved sons. This week, I beg you to remember these boys. I beg you to step in when a child needs help. I beg you to pay attention to Amber Alerts and learn about the missing children in your area. Please don't let them be forgotten. Don't let them be just another dusty box on a shelf. As heartbreaking as these stories are, they are important. And I'm glad that some good has come out of these terrible, awful disappearances. Thank you so much for crafting with me today. As always, I would love to see what you're working on. Feel free to tag me in your creations. If you want more content between episodes, consider following me on TikTok. Thank you to Abby for her role in pre-production. These episodes would not be nearly as cohesive without her. And thank you to Ricky Webb, who recommended Johnny Gosch's story to me. Without his suggestion, I never would have found out about the Milk Carton Initiative. If you have a case you'd like me to cover, shoot me an email or message me at the handles listed in the description box. Remember to choose kindness where you can, because kindness is a choice. And check back in with me soon. I don't know what I'm going to cover next yet, but it will definitely not be a missing children's case or a case that involves children at all, because I need a break and this has made me so incredibly sad, and I'm going to go hug my own babies. Okay, see you soon. Bye. Clown's not all that scary. He's kind of more silly than anything, but that kind of captures the essence of me anyway. Be sure to check back soon, because our next episode will be about the Fall Horse Cult. I haven't heard of it before, and I'm really excited to get started, and I hope you are too.